Welcome, everyone. We're just about at the top of the hour. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Natural Resource Damages from the War in Ukraine webinar, organized by Integral Consulting and Montrose Environmental. We have a great program for you today and really look forward to an inspiring dialogue. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and then distributed to any registrants. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window to ask any questions. Those questions will not be public. They will just go to the organizers of the webinar. Here's the schedule for the next 60 minutes. Our hosts will move through their proposed framework over the next 45, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion with our hosts. Let me introduce Dr. Tomasi and Dr. Wenning. Before his consulting career, Dr. Tomasi of Integral Consulting was a tenured professor at a leading university, teaching and conducting research on environmental policy analysis and the value of natural resources and ecosystem services. His consulting work has been conducted for the World Bank, USAID, large foundations, state and federal governments, and major corporations. He is a recognized expert in assessing damages to resources in the environment and has been involved in approximately 60 such cases, including large complex assignments, such as having a lead role on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill damage assessment. Dr. Richard Wenning, Rick of Montrose Environmental, is an environmental risk assessment specialist and an expert in impact assessment applied to pollution and degradation caused by industrial accidents and natural resources. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Wenning to begin the discussion.
Well, thank you, Zach. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this hour to talk about environmental damage assessment and a little bit about the situation in Ukraine. We're going to use Ukraine as a backdrop for this discussion on the methodology. And we're going to begin with this word cloud that you see here. It's a word cloud generated from the paper that Ted and I published earlier this year on the notion that the U.S. framework for natural resource damage assessment could be useful in the context of conflict and specifically in the context of the situation in Ukraine. And it's also a reminder, Ted, for you and I, of a bit of a disclaimer of sorts in this discussion that we're going to share with you over the next hour. We don't have any special knowledge of the situation in Ukraine, the environmental damages, what the government might be thinking about in the future as it certainly should be thinking about recovery. We're giving you our perspective. We have, Ted, in my case, a long history of looking at damage assessment, impact assessment as it applies in natural disasters, dam failures, climatic events, as well as in industrial accidents and the pollution that might arise from all sorts of accidents, oil spills and chemical alike. And we think about this from our perspective in the U.S. framework for natural resource damage assessment. You'll hear more about that here in a bit, and the European Union's Environmental Liability Directive. But what we think we have to share in terms of the experiences in that context, we feel strongly could apply in the context of conflict. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of the methodologies that other organizations are using and how we might be able to coordinate, blend, collaborate on a framework that takes the lessons learned and puts them forward for situations such as the conflict in Ukraine. Would you agree, Ted?
Sure. Yeah, it struck me that the situation is much more expansive in Ukraine than many of the things that you and I have done. But the basic structure is the same, that there's a harm and it needs to be redressed, and there needs to be a basis for deciding what to do and estimating the cost of what needs to be done. So the parallels are there, and those struck us, and so we embarked on this thought process we'll be talking more about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Zach, you'll be our visual host. If you move on, that'd be great. So let's begin, and we'll start with our thinking on quantifying environmental damages. And it began last year with, as I said, with the publication in December of this paper that you see before you, thinking about our views on the US NRDA, Natural Resource Damage Assessment Framework, and how it might apply in the context of conflict in Ukraine. And from that paper, we talk about really 4 objectives in the damage assessment process. We talk about a science-based, data-driven assessment framework. We have to have a strong factual base to understand conditions before conflict, before an event, so that we can begin to think about the consequences of the event or the conflict itself, and then think forward to recovery to be able to return the environment to its condition in the no war or in the baseline condition. We talk about the concept, the objective of coordinating data collection efforts, so that we can have a coherent understanding as full as possible of the injuries to the environment that become important in the damage estimation process. And we talk in that third objective about that damage estimation process, how we need to capture the consequences in a financial perspective of the injuries to the environment, the loss of services, et cetera. Ted, as an economist, will be talking about that in more detail. And then our last objective in this framework of damage assessment, really reflecting on restoration and planning for recovery. So from factual collection through to a recovery, these 4 objectives are embodied in what we believe would be a comprehensive damage assessment framework. And those objectives really embody 5 essential elements. There's the science element, which in some respects, Ted, I suppose I represent, is someone with an impact assessment and environmental sampling and collection and evaluation background. We have the economics perspective, which certainly you embody, taking that scientific and environmental information and thinking about it in the context of economics and costs and monetary values. Our goals, metrics for how we measure the environment, metrics for how we think about the success of recovery, and of course that other element, that last element we talk about, is a recovery strategy. And I think, Ted, that's what we tried to accomplish in that paper, right? Really laying out those views with those essential elements. Let's move on, Zach. So with that foundation, I think it's important to recognize that a strong foundation for damage assessment begins with an understanding of the environment before war in this context of Ukraine, and to be able to understand the injuries caused by that war. 1 year later, I think what we can begin to understand as we reflect on the condition of the environment at the outset, really is gained because we have a very good understanding with a strong science and research foundation in Ukraine for different aspects of their environment. We understand the biomes in the country. We understand the hydrographic areas in the country. We understand special resources like exist in the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov. Wild horses you see at the bottom of your screen, the Askania Nova Natural Bioreserve. We have a strong foundation from which to begin to think about the condition of the environment before catastrophe, before war, before an event. And we can use that information to establish a baseline condition. And that becomes a very important foundation in the damage assessment process. Zach? Because unfortunately, what we're going to be doing is looking at the condition of the environment today relative to our understanding of the environment in Ukraine, for instance, in the past. There's a lot of statistics I think we've all seen about the situation in Ukraine at present. And the map here shows you and reminds all of us that this is a nationwide consideration of what's happening. Some areas affected obviously more deeply than others, but we know from social media, from the news reporting every day about the consequences on biodiversity, the large expanse of wildfires and conflict-related wildfires, the notion of damages along the coastal environment in the country. And my gosh, we've got 5 million people without safe drinking water at this stage. And those are terrible statistics and are just a snapshot of what obviously is a very complicated and much larger environmental situation. And as we think about damage assessment, the accuracy of what we understand before the war and the environmental conditions in Ukraine, and what we understand with some accuracy and completeness about the condition during and after the conflict becomes very important and affects the quality of the damage assessment work that organizations and the government would be undertaking, I imagine. The delta between that baseline pre-war condition and the condition that we find the environment after the war or after this catastrophe event is really what we're trying to capture in a damage assessment. And it's these two bodies of information which become very, very important in thinking about conflict. And Zach,
and I think this captures, I think this captures my comment that, when we do damage assessment in the European Union or in the United States, the effects tend to be a little bit more smaller in scope than what we're seeing on this page. Yeah, and so this creates challenges. And when you mentioned that, all the different pieces of information need to be brought together in a coherent way, there's a lot going on here. And, compared to, say, an oil spill where there's a whole bunch of things going on that have to be brought together in a coherent way, here the challenges really are significant because of the scale and the variety of impacts that need to be understood in a way that kind of all fits together at the end of the day. And I view this as a significant methodological challenge.
Yeah, exactly, Ted. No, thank you. And of course, for this discussion that we're having with everybody here, very much want it to be interactive. I think my perspective on the environment and your perspective as a resource economist, I mean, this isn't a linear adventure, so to speak. It doesn't simply start by just focusing on baseline collection, then let's focus on the change to the environment, then let's just focus on calculating damages. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth that has to happen between different communities of experts that are engaged in damage assessment, right? So Zach, as you flip to the next slide, I think we'd be remiss if we don't give a special message to the situation that we all heard about last week with the dam collapse, and as it's shown here. Sometimes in the context of large catastrophes, industrial accidents, natural disasters, here in the context of war, there are special events that are just so significant that as we think about damage assessment affecting an entire region, or in the context of Ukraine, there are at times, unfortunately, events that deserve some special attention. And we call attention to this because the magnitude of the dam failure and the resources that have been put at risk or affected by this event just deserve some special consideration. And that's important for us to recognize. Ted, in our paper when we published in December, we touched on the notion of ecocide, whereby events occur purposely to harm the environment to achieve some different end, a military end, for instance, or something. But that's not to say that our approach to the damage assessment would be any particularly different, would it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that attributes special status to an event such as this, not just its magnitude, but the intentionality of it. But it certainly warrants special attention on its own merits, irrespective of the intent. We know from other large dam breaches in Brazil and elsewhere that
Right.
these are amazingly impactful events, and understanding them really requires a very targeted assessment.
Yeah, no, exactly right. That's exactly right. So stepping forward to the next slide in this discussion then is really, let's start to zero in a little bit on the damage assessment process itself. And I'll set the stage just a little bit, and Ted will guide us in more detail. But as we think about damage assessment, and that process, we have immediate needs. And you can see a list of those on the left side of your screen. Oil spills, deforestation, conflict wildfires, soil erosion, et cetera, pollution. And on the right side of your screen, we have long-term goals that need to be achieved. We'd like to be able to return to the environment to a condition prior to conflict, prior to an event. But we may also be striving for something much deeper, more resilient, more long-term, a green economy. There are different elements in between what we are facing with as immediate needs and where we would like to be able to return the environment is damage assessment and the methodologies that are there to translate and understand those immediate needs, fit them into a process that allows us not only to repair, restore, replace those needs, but aim us in that right direction. And I think, Ted, we've been thinking about damage assessment as a bridge of sorts. The stronger that bridge, the more comprehensive, the more detailed, the more fully we can develop the framework by which the environmental injuries are examined, the data is collected, and how that is interpreted in terms of restoration and compensation, the stronger can be that long-term recovery and the goals that we're trying to achieve. And this damage assessment methodology is a very important bridge. And I think that was one of our inspirations as we thought back to accidents and disasters.
Yeah, and I think about this very concretely, right? In the middle are things that you measure, multiply, divide, raise to exponents, add up. They're computations. And at the end of the day, the left-hand side, what was harmed, has to communicate via these methodologies
Right.
to the right-hand side how much needs to be done to fix it, and what is that going to cost. And so that, given the expansive scope and sweep of types of effects, these methodologies have to pull together a lot of information in some sort of coherent way. They have to have some properties that they don't double count stuff, and that they are understandable, and they have a basis about why you multiplied by this or divided by that, that's explicable and transparent. So the challenge really at the end of the day is to know that you have enough money to achieve the goals in the right term to redress the harms on the left side. And it goes through this methodological step that a lot of people and a lot of organizations and a lot of things going on there that creates challenges. And so really that's what it seems to me, at least from my perspective, is the challenge that we've been thinking about is how to connect the injury to the restoration that's needed, which is fundamental to damage assessment.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Zach, as you flip ahead, it's an understatement to say that this is a large undertaking, for sure. But there are many resources, both in terms of international methodologies. We have the benefits of preliminary damage assessments that have been performed by World Bank and in the United Nations for Ukraine to give some scope to the magnitude of the issues that the country is facing. We have damage assessment methodologies that the country itself is thinking about, all aimed. These bodies of information, these bodies of resources, all aimed towards recovery. And again, as I said at the outset, we don't have any special knowledge about what's happening, but Ted, from our experiences, and you mentioned Brazil, as we've helped in some very terrible dam collapse situations, other countries where we have really thought about in a process, a methodical process of how we can take advantage of the experts, the tools, and bring them together in a coordinated fashion that perhaps creates new efficiencies and more fully accounts for the injuries and the estimation of the money, the funds that are needed to restore the environment. So as we really think about where damage assessment can lead to in a conflict setting, it's always a collaboration, because there are so many different elements that need to be brought to bear, both in terms of methodologies and expertise that can guide a recovery. And that's really been one of the themes of what we'd like to communicate here in this webinar. Ted, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that says it.
Yeah. So I think we'll switch gears a little bit. Again, my perspective from an environmental perspective, and as someone involved in data collection, Ted, it's always an interesting learning curve to see how that information, where I'm used to measurements and in terms of land and chemistry and pollution, and to see how that can be translated to the impacts directly to communities, to people, to a country, to a nation, to a region that is seeking to restore those types of injuries. So Zach, with the next slide, I'm keen, Ted, for you to kind of guide us and take charge from me, thankfully, on this damage assessment framework and what we have to say here.
Yeah, and I've chimed in freely on yours segment, so feel free to do the same. I know you will. So this is sort of an overall assessment framework that is used. A pre-assessment stage is just kind of figuring out where the material effects are likely to be, planning, understanding what we know, what we don't know, and really allocating resources up front to those things that are most important. Second step is identifying the important data gaps. Now, one of the themes that I will stress is that there are a lot of things going on in a circumstance such as this, and you can't treat them all at an extremely high level of rigor and to the nth decimal point. And so you prioritize which things are the most important data gaps to fill, what are the most important places to spend your resources. So the planning aspect of this is very, very important. Then the third step, the actual damage assessment, I'll talk more about that. But again, it links from damages to restoration planning in the fourth step. How do we identify what specific kinds of actions are needed and will be an efficient way to address the harms that are caused? And so that's the restoration planning, and sort of moving from broad ideas through to actual engineering designs for putting stuff in the ground, and actually taking that step. And then in the fifth, making sure we deliver. Monitoring and adaptive management. You don't know everything that you would like to know when you get started. And so monitoring progress and making sure that you're actually delivering the benefits, that this is not a hollow exercise, is an important element to the follow-up. Next slide, Zach. So in any kind of assessment, you go from very little information or data through to highly sophisticated multiple lines of evidence, site-specific facts, lots of rigor, lots of sample points, and where you need to fall along this continuum will vary. It'll vary according to where the information will be used. Is this going to a court of law, which is different than going to maybe some other decision-making that's being done more on the fly to, what should we be doing to enhance productivity of agriculture in areas that have been recovered by Ukraine from Russian occupation, what can we do now? So not everywhere will get to the nth degree. Most places will be beyond the bottom rung, but planning this out is very important, especially when you think that there may be ultimately some sort of legal or other formal basis, in which case you really need to be able to explain in a transparent way and have defenses for the information that you're presenting to make a claim for damages.
Yeah, Ken, I'm
Next
wondering, from my perspective, we think about need to know and nice to know information, and we may even think about need to know very, very well and detailed versus we need to understand. Are there any rules of thumb as you think about damage assessment relative to different types of information, or is that really too hard to generalize?
I think it's very hard to generalize, and I think the art and what comes from experience is recognizing, which situation you're in for what resources and over what space. There are formal methods. I've used decision analytic methods where you generate a distribution of possible outcomes, and you then understand the key drivers of that. And then you can look at the value of information of certain kinds. And that's a very useful technique for something like this, where there is limited resources that can be expended in order to address the harms, and really organizing your thoughts around a process for identifying key uncertainties and key elements of the analysis that are material could be extremely useful. We found that useful in general remedial decision making and damage assessment, and in decision making in general for complex organizations facing complex questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Next slide. So here is kind of a conceptual outline of the way the damage assessment works. On the vertical axis, we have some measure of the amount of environmental quality. To my economic mind, that's kind of its value. Different ways we can measure value that we will talk about, but some measure of the value of the environment based on the quality of the natural resources. Now, obviously, in the Anthropocene, we're not dealing with pristine conditions or even highly natural conditions in many circumstances. So we have a variety of non-war-related environmental effects that cause a reduction in the quality and amount of resources down to what this is, this baseline condition. And that baseline occurs over time. It's not necessarily pre-war. That could be changing over time. If we're not doing this assessment and finalizing it for many years, then changes would have happened irrespective of the war. So this is a complex counterfactual that we need to uncover. But the injuries from the conflict are measured relative to this baseline condition, the but for the war condition. Hopefully that doesn't go on for very long, and this conflict is over soon. After which there's a recovery process, and that recovery process can in some places or for some resources be natural. Not much is expended in the way of helping this along. You just wait for nature to take its course. But for many, and perhaps most impacts, there will be some primary remediation. So let me give you an example. Suppose there's ordinance that it comes into a forest area, and there's a fire that is set and the forest burns. Well, you could just wait. Or primary remediation may be getting the unexpended ordinance out, getting out, major impediments, physical impediments to using the forest area. It's like remediation or cleanup activity in the context of an oil spill or a contaminated site. Complementary activities then would be, having done kind of base cleanup, get rid of the rubble, get rid of the debris, get rid of unexpired ordnance. The complementary activities after that would speed recovery to baseline. So this might be in the forest situation, planting new forest. You could let it go through forest succession, which could take a long time, or you could jumpstart that by preparing the area and actually planting it up to species that you wish to have ultimately, and move things along towards baseline conditions or enhancements of baseline conditions. And then there's a compensatory component. So for example, in the case of forestry, a forest that was being harvested, also providing ecological goods and services pre-war, and then the war disrupts those, you don't have those benefits for a long time. So you are unable to harvest. If you planted this area and it was recovering, it may take decades to get back to the point at which you are able to harvest in the way that you would have at baseline. And so there's a loss in the meantime. So you might enhance other forest areas or plant even more forest in order to compensate for those losses that occur in the meantime. You couldn't harvest, you lost income, and you lost ecosystem goods and services, habitat, and carbon sequestration that forest would have provided. And so there's a compensatory component where you actually do more and move beyond baseline. So that's the basic kind of structure of determining what are the magnitudes of the injuries in a quantified sense. And then what are the primary complementary and compensatory activities at what scales and in what locations and doing what things will get you back to baseline and compensate for the interim effects. So that's the basic structure. I'd like to move on now to a couple, before I do, this is kind of the big picture questions to be answered that we've talked about before, so I can be quick. On the left-hand side here is Rick's territory of the measurements. What went on, over what space, what sectors and activities were likely affected, how are these resources used, but really what was lost and impaired in a biophysical sense. And then secondarily, what do those resources do for other resources and for people or for people? So this is a science and measurement task on the left-hand side. And that gives you some amount of service reduction caused by the war, this negative error effect on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is what we want to connect to, those long-range goals and things that we would like to achieve in Ukraine from restoration. So what are those activities and how much restoration is needed? Well, that second component comes about when there's equality between, and I mean this as a mathematical equal sign, between the amount of service gain generated from those restoration activities to offset the amount of negative harm. And those are the multiplications and additions and raising to exponents that we were talking about, that the methods have to achieve. They have to make this linkage. So that's where we're headed. And if we go to the next slide, I'll kind of run through some examples here. So imagine we're looking at non-marine water resources, right? So we have these science measurements of the nature and extent of the impacts to groundwater quality and surface water quality, two kinds of resources, but they interact. Groundwater can discharge to surface water. Surface water can percolate into groundwater. So these are not disconnected hydrologic or ecological systems. So understanding that is the purview of the science aspects of the methodologies. And then this notion of services is that you say, well, what is that? What do those resources do? And we can think about agricultural and forestry. I'll put agriculture and forestry kind of together there. Water's used for irrigation. There's residential use of water. That's used in a variety of ways, but including producing healthy individuals or unhealthy ones if it's contaminated water. There are, EGS stands for environmental goods and services. So some of the services are not directly to people, but indirectly to other resources. So the groundwater that discharges to surface water supports fisheries in the surface water that are used for subsistence or recreation purposes. So there's a variety of interconnected impacts on different sectors, if you will. And then you have to say, this is the measurement task. Well, how am I going to measure the amount of that? What is a quantifiable measure? So for agriculture, it may be the value of production. There's measures that are similar to the value to consumers or the value of health. Or if you're talking about ecological services, what would it take to put them back so that they are producing what they would have produced absent the impact that you're looking at. So here's kind of one cut at how information can be accumulated in order to get to that middle part of the prior slide, what was lost and what was gained, and that the measures of value will be that connectivity. So if we go on the next slide.
Ted,
go ahead.
As we look at this slide here, and this is fine to stay here, Zach, I'm struck by the notion of what should drive the damage assessment process, in your opinion? Is it the quantification of the chemical concentrations in the soil, the number of unexploded ordnance, the number of animals that are lost, real quantitative measures of the environment? Or really should we be working backwards, beginning with the services that are impacted and the sectors that are affected and those key metrics that define those sectors? What would you think?
That's a super question. In my view, and in my experience, a lot of time and effort is devoted to the measurement task in ways that are not especially helpful to the ultimate goal of figuring out how much restoration is enough, right? So if you have a restoration action that's like discrete, you can do none, you can do 1,000 acres, or you can do 5,000 acres. You don't have to know to the nth decimal point. You just have to know, am I above or below the 1,000 acre threshold? Right, which is a different question. So I think if you begin with the end in mind of how are you going to quantify in a way that links to restoration, that guides how much and of what kind of information and of what quality and extent do you need in order to get through to the decision of what do we need to do about this. Sometimes it's super obvious, right? And you don't need a lot of fancy measurement to get through to a decision. Other times it's not at all obvious, and you need considerable expenditure of effort on the things that you mentioned in order to understand how much you need to do. So I think that when you have a target of restoration, the critical thing, and it's like in our world, a data quality objective. What question do I need to answer with this information? And in our case, the question is, how much restoration is enough? And that's not necessarily, to a high degree of certainty, how many passerine birds had how many fewer offspring in a given year. Maybe you need to know that, or maybe you don't need to know it to a high degree of certainty. So I think that's an excellent question.
Okay. Yeah. No, thanks for that.
Turning to this slide, I guess my point here is that Now you need to accumulate and understand, or, there's cuts at information from a variety of perspectives. So turning from water, say, to soil. And I understand soil impacts from a variety of drivers, right? Air quality is a driver of soil. Grounded surface water that we had in the last slide is a driver of soil. Physical effects, digging trenches, driving machinery around, ordnance in the fields, holes in the ground that weren't there that are causing erosion, all affect soil, which are, is a form of natural capital that affects these sectors. But if I'm going to measure, say, the impact of groundwater or any of the other effects of soil on agricultural production and the value of agricultural production, well, there's a lot of non-environmental stuff that's affecting agriculture. Are there ports? Are there roads? Are there tractors? Are there people with the relevant knowledge in the area in order to do things the way we did pre-war? Or are the people now important folks migrated to other places? And has there been so much disrupt in the economy that those impacts affect agriculture and households and health and education and ecological services? So there are any number of broader, beyond environmental analyses and investigations going on that also have an impact and interrelate with the environmental aspects of this assessment. So that's really broadens the not only the assessment, but this question that you asked: what do we need to know? How do we need to coordinate and collaborate? So if there's someone over here doing physical capital infrastructure, and that's roads to forest areas, and I'm looking at the impact of fires on forest production, and I'm counting the impacts of roads, and the other folks are counting the impacts of roads, we've got a double counting of the impacts of roads. So we really kind of need to make sure that's just the collaboration aspect and the coordination aspect, Rick, that you were talking about, because there's a lot of moving parts here. And at the end of the day, they have to speak to one another in a sufficiently coherent way that you're not making mistakes. You're putting on a comprehensive analysis, but one that avoids double counting or an incoherence between the methods that they don't coordinate.
Sure.
Next slide.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot, I think, in the context of a framework about this concern on double counting, haven't we? It's important in the context of coordination and collaboration to be mindful of sectors, resources, actions that might double count particular injuries or impacts.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways to add up the information. So you can take a bunch of information and then disaggregate it according to resource, towards sector, towards restoration. So the information has to speak to one another.
Right.
So this is kind of a summary slide here, where we need to think about, in addition to the non-environmental impacts, the natural capital impacts, because we need to figure out, are we going to have enough money to do the things we need in order to address the harms? And so, our perspective, coming from a damage assessment perspective, exactly that. We need to figure out how to pay for those things that can address these harms coming through what matters to the people of Ukraine. What are the sources of economic and social well-being, and how do the various impacts on them interact, and how can we come up with scaled restoration that can equal then the amount of reparations? So, that's going back to that big picture set of questions that we started out with. And this is really the restoration strategy and planning aspect of the exercise.
Yeah, another thought, Ted, we've spent some time thinking about is it's in the concept of build back better. we're sensitive in our experiences where we're looking at injuries, we're thinking about damages, we're thinking about the repairs, the restoration, the replacements, to not do or be careful about how much more we do than was present before. I think, and I'm not sure I'm expressing that correctly, but this notion that as we launch, as Ukraine, for instance, thinks about the road to recovery, thinking about, aiming towards maybe a higher level of sustainability into the future for its environment in different sectors, or resilience, green. How does that, do you have any thought, share any thoughts about how we incorporate those notions here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily just roll back the clock, right?
Yeah,
To recreate what one has, because there are, there are opportunities here, as horrific as the impacts are and continue to be. In the recovery phase, there are opportunities to take money and do the best that you can do with that money in order to, effectively put the country on a path. So you can be intentional about that. You don't have to put back, stick for stick, blade of grass for blade of grass, molecule for molecule, what was there before, but you can be creative in how you address those harms, creating more value than otherwise.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're getting close to the end of our time here, and we want to leave time for questions and comments. So why don't we go to the next slide, Zach? So this is just kind of pulling it together. There are a lot of things going on. Social capital and governance, environment and natural capital, physical capital, lots of different things that they support, all of which feed into the economic and social well-being. And the goal here is to figure out a way to get to that middle critical element. And so I think with that we can move on and turn it over to any questions or commentary from the audience.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ted and Rick. We had a couple of questions come in. The first one is, can you explain how you would approach ranking the solutions to immediate needs to address and improve the long-term priorities?
Prioritization in the context of what do you do first? I'm wondering if that's the nature of the question, Zach. Should we be fixing soils first or fixing forests? Should we be focusing on certain sectors versus other sectors first? How do we do that? And that's an important question in the context of the recovery strategy and the fundamental principles of what will return social well-being and economic productivity. I think it's not everything needs to be addressed at the exact same time, but you do have to have a logic to that recovery strategy, don't you, Ted?
Well, yeah, but I'm reminded here of something that we do all the time, which is early restoration in the process of an assessment, right? And emergency restoration. So there are, like I said, there's some stuff you just know. Yeah. And for me, the things that you just know that are anything that you can do to support the economic production in Ukraine and social support mechanisms, health, housing, water, soil productivity in agricultural regions, both that were and productivity in general in areas that were not in the war theater, that may have been recovered from Russian occupied zones. What can we do immediately? You don't have to know everything in order to go do stuff. So I would put that in the context of there are things that need to be done that you are sure will be productive and you would do at the end of the day, that you don't have to wait to the end of the analysis to do. And I think we should be embarking and prioritizing those. And to my mind, it really is those elements that are critical: infrastructure, health, social support systems and productivity in the usual sense of the term. Now, some of that depends critically on natural capital in some places, and water systems and those kinds of things, and others are more in the physical and other support realms. But there's by no means do we need to wait for some big elaborate process to get started on things that we know need to be done now.
No, I think that's good, Ted. You say that. The environment is one element of a much larger wholesome picture of what needs to happen to recover the country. And certainly one example, if you were to narrow into just the environmental component, and you're looking to restore fisheries, the priority might be first to address some of the water pollution that would then create an environment that would allow you to efficiently restore fisheries. I mean, there are some priorities that you can glean at a microcosm of sorts in different environmental compartments, but there are also priorities that have to be assessed at this very large scale, right?
Yeah, particularly sensitive environments, particularly threatened species, those kinds of things. So yes, there are ways to parse this out, and we know them from emergency and early restoration kinds of thinking in other circumstances.
Right.
Thanks for that. We've got a couple of questions on us the same topic around baseline injuries and how you determine baseline injuries. So can you elaborate on how any pre-war injuries would be separated, a separate condition, and how we would typically not restore any injured condition to another injured condition?
I have two questions there.
Well, that last one is an interesting point.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me just say that this is a mission critical element that is the hardest element in some ways of damage assessment.
Agreed.
Baseline is a counterfactual. You can't observe it. It's not necessarily pre-war because, as I said, things will go on in the meantime. It's also not entirely clear what pre-war means here. I mean, that 2014 is a potential starting point,
right?
Which means that not 2022, and therefore we have a long time period of impacts and stressors in a variety of areas over time that are independent of the war, particularized war effects in the war theater. This is always a tricky business. It's a causality question, and causality is notoriously hard to determine. So the questioner goes right to the heart of the major challenge, or a major challenge here. Rick, do you have comments on that?
I think you said it perfectly. Nothing to add there. I have in the past thought very specifically about, well, I just want to go to the day before the war, but really that's not what we're thinking about in the context of baseline. No, I have nothing more to add to that.
I mean, there's a lot of pre-war information and post 2014 information that can be drawn on. I mean, there are certain trends. There are certain trends in other areas that are similar biomes that are, more broad scale impacts on resources that are common across areas. So, there are ways to piece together information. But the other thing I'll say is that while baseline is important, there are certain things that are just obvious that you can separate out that are some of those most important things to understand their effects. So I think the war effects in terms of physical impacts, I think it's also are those that are easier, and also where the increment is kind of a different kind. So an area where there's, like the dam breach, an area where there is a significant oil spill in an area, you can do increments from a given amount of oil and estimate its effects without knowing in exacting detail what other compounds were there. So, there are ways to do this. It's a tricky business, but I don't think that is a showstopper that kind of undermines the program here.
Yeah. I agree.
Thanks. Another question that is on a similar topic is, what will be the remediation plan for soil and water that are contaminated?
Oh God.
Designing that plan, and where does the assessment of the damages play a role?
Well, there are certainly plenty of case studies around the world in science publications that talk about the process of remediation, right? And that would be a great place to start. Talking about the types of information you need tells you how to think about the environment in which you're trying to restore water resources, for example, or soil, and what the outcomes might be for certain investments in certain types of activities. So that's just some universals that you'd want to apply to that particular environment that you're thinking about. As opposed to, with respect specifically to Ukraine, I have no idea. So I'm thinking only in the context of generalities. But there are certainly processes that you can follow and fundamental rules of data collection and interpretation, goal setting, metrics that you need to follow in order to understand pre-impact conditions and to be able to follow that monitoring strategy for recovery when you implement a remediation plan. And those metrics become important when you need to deviate from those goals of your remediation, because the world is changing and climate is becoming more of a factor. And so adaptive management becomes important. But there isn't a precise prescription, is there, Ted? We use site specific.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to separate out the immediate from the longer term, right? So, what you're talking about is the things that people in hydrogeochemistry have dealt with around the globe for many years, of what, in the long term, what is the best approach to really restore resources. But I think in the near term, obviously, the substitution of safe sources of drinking water for unsafe ones is critical, as is source control. So anything that you can do to keep groundwater from migrating into particular areas where it will cause additional harm would be, all right, what can we do there? So I think there is sort of near-term or immediate things that can be done where you have, exposure scenarios that are dire, and again, kind of on an emergency basis, you do certain things. And then over the longer term, what are the migration pathways? What is the rate of migration? How really should you address a contaminated groundwater site? Is a complex task that can be carried out over a longer term and in a more deliberate way. But there are some immediate things for delivery of water for its intended purpose. So to what degree do you need to treat water for agricultural use versus for drinking water? Depends on the use of the water. What is it sustaining? So I don't think there's a particularized response to that question, but there are general principles that I think we can apply for immediate versus longer term remedies.
And Ted, just to add quickly to that, right, in the context of damage assessment, in a framework, there are social specific considerations, there are maybe cultural specific considerations, economic specific considerations that will influence not the direction and the approach that you might take in a remediation assignment. And you have to think about that. Yeah, exactly right.
Yep,
okay.
And not all places are created equal here. So there's a high degree of variability.
Yep. Zach, one last question, perhaps? Do we have time?
One last comment and question is, Can you comment further on the importance of coordination and collaboration among international agencies and experts in Ukraine's recovery?
Yeah, Ted, we thought about that, and certainly in the news, we see a lot of reporting on estimates of damages to different sectors, to different areas, what it's going to cost the country to recover, and those are all excellent building blocks. But at the end of the day, Ted, I think what concerns us as an environmental person, and perhaps as you as an economist, is you want that orchestra, those musicians that represent these different perspectives and these different views on the recovery and the injuries, to really be singing from the same sheet of music. I love that analogy that you and I've talked about. I just may have mixed it up.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, all the work that's going on is valuable from different perspectives and for different uses. So, you know, it's not that, you know, we have any magic answers about anything. However, one of the things that, you know, I'll kind of go back to an initial theme. One of the things that we have done in our experience is, when you have a whole bunch of different impacts, think of the Gulf oil spill that BP faced, you know, to dolphins and beaches and sediments and corals and this and that and the other, it eventually has to come together in some coherent and way. And so to the extent that you can be more considered going in and understand and achieve a degree of coordination without saying, okay, here is the grand unification theorem that's coming from the brains of Ted and Rick, and that's the only way to go about it. I think our perspective is there are a variety of ways, they're all valuable, and perhaps some of what we've talked about today is a way to think about how things can fit together through the construct of impacts on services that can be measured according to the effect of those impacts on people and the environment. And I think that perspective is kind of an overarching one that can be used to understand better the nature of the collaborations that are needed.
Yeah, well said, Ted. Absolutely agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We're a little over time, so I'll wrap it up. Thanks everyone for joining, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. As I stated at the beginning, we will be sending out a link to the recording for all who have registered. And if you would like more information or to get involved, please reach out to Ted or Rick. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.